What really makes a sword special? Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. So what really makes a sword special to you or to anyone else? I was watching a video by Matthew Jensen, in fact, just before I turned on my camera here. It kind of inspired me to make this one. And he was going through some of the swords that are special to him, his favourite swords, and it was a very, very interesting video because it actually made me think about certain things about what my favourite swords are from some different angles. And obviously there are some immediate things that will probably come to your mind, you know, the sentimental value to a sword. Were you given it? Did you find it in a particular circumstance? Is there some story attached to that sword? You know, for example, one of the Albions I used to own, I remember I bought from the now defunct Albion Europe from a guy called Soren, Swedish guy, and who basically, it was a damaged one, and I got it really cheap because he was going to have to return it back to America, and so I got a special deal on it, and I had it fixed in no time, and I felt really smug about that sword because I got it at a massive knockdown price. So I was, you know, there's that kind of reason. And then there's another, there's antique swords that I have found in antique shops that didn't have any other swords, and there was just one sword there, and it turned out to be a really nice one, and maybe it was a nice day and things like this. So you have sentimental reasons for having favourite swords, but I'm not going to consider that so much in this video. What I'm going to consider more is stats and quality. So what's interesting is when we're talking about standard makes and models of sword, I've actually got an antique example here, but you could be talking about modern ones. So it could be, for example, a Handmade bamboo mat katana, or it could be a Kavitan Easton Mark III saber, or it could be, in the case of this, a model 1879 Martini Henry sawback bayonet. Whether you're talking about any of these standard things, there are variations within those things, as you know, everybody knows. Okay, so you will just find that some of them you pick up, and there's something, you might have 10 of them in front of you, and this is equally true anyone who does HEMA or martial arts, where there's standard models of practice weapon. You'll know this if you ever go to an event where there's a dealer, trader selling these things. You can go for a standard model. It could be a Handmade Hutton saber, or a Kavetan Federschwert, or whatever, and you pick up 10 of those things. They'll all be slightly different. Their grips will feel slightly differently shaped and slightly differently sized, maybe, and that will be a bigger or smaller difference depending on the make. The way that it feels in the hand, the leverage, so the precise amount of distal taper or profile taper, or the sharpening if it's a sharp blade, will be slightly different from one to another, with the result that they'll all feel slightly different. And you know, coming back to Matthew Jensen, he often refers to his beloved bamboo mat, a Handmade bamboo mat katana that is a little bit heavier than the standard bamboo mat katana, and he prefers it for that. It's a little bit stouter. It's maybe an older generation model, and they've maybe updated it a bit since then. In fact, I think the Handmade factory is burnt down at one stage, I think. So anyway, it's probably a different production run and whatever. So the fact is that even with standard models, you get a difference in handling. But there's another element as well, which I'd mention, and that is quality. Now, when you're talking about whether it's a handmade object or a factory-made objects, and obviously factory-made objects are still handmade, it's just they're made usually on more of a production line rather than made by one individual or even one small workshop. And I think that's actually, there's a little bit of a misconception there we need to clear up, is that basically all swords are handmade. There aren't robots somewhere making swords. If you go to a huge factory like Windlass or someone, or Hanway, it's still people there hammering blades and sticking them on machines and grinding them and then sharpening them by hand, all that kind of stuff. So most sword making can't be automated in that sense. They're still handmade, and therefore there is variation between those things. And it's as well as the statistical variation that I've just talked about, there's also the mechanical variation. Now, it's very clear to me, particularly with Chinese made, but it can also be with Indian made, and it can also be with British or American or Canadian made swords. There is variation in quality from one sword to another. With a really big company like Hanway, or Windlass, or whoever you want to look at, one of those really big companies churning out lots and lots, hundreds and hundreds of swords a year, thousands of swords a year, You will find if you take 10 of them and you put them through strength tests, you sharpen them, you cut with them, you bend them, you bash them into things, there will be a different survival rate. And that was true of antiques as well. That's one of the reasons I'm holding an antique here. That isn't a modern phenomenon. That was also true of antiques. Now, these did receive what were called proof tests, and some companies, Windlass famously do that. They actually use the British Wilkinson proof test on their most of their swords anyway, certainly their military swords and a lot of their swords that are intended to be used. And that is essentially, it's a flex test, there's a bashing element to it, there's various things. Maybe I'll do a dedicated video on that at some point, but basically it's a proof test in the same way that firearms are proved. So before that goes out of the factory, that has been tested. But swords can pass that proof test and there still be a variation of quality between them. And if you get your 10 swords that on paper are supposed to be identical, not only will they all feel very slightly differently, but they'll also perform slightly differently. A good example of that is edge hardness. So we usually talk about a range of edge hardnesses. So if blades are supposed to be, let's say 52 Rockwell on the edge, if you take 10 examples or 100 examples, you'll find that there is a variation, there's a range, and you might find the softest ones are maybe only 47 Rockwell at the edge, and the hardest ones might be 56 Rockwell at the edge. So there'll be a variation between the models. Now clearly, with higher quality brands, we generally find the variations are less. But with mass-produced stuff coming particularly out of Asia, you'll often find the variations are quite big. And so therefore, if you're looking at a standard model like the Hanway Bamboo Mat or a Windlass Oakshot Type 14 or whatever, something that's made in large numbers, you will find there is really quite a lot of mechanical variation from one example to another, as well as what it feels like in the hand. And this, of course, you must bear in mind when you're watching reviews, or indeed if you're just seeing one of these examples. You might be handling or using one of the good ones or one of the bad ones or one of the average ones, and you don't necessarily know unless you tested lots of them. Now, with that in mind, and again taking a feather out of Matthew Jensen's cap, I'm going to show 3 swords that I really like, without sentimental reasons. I just really like them, but you wouldn't necessarily think, given that I own literally hundreds of swords, I don't even know how many swords I own, maybe 300 at the moment, but bearing in mind I'm an antique dealer, so I have most of those are stock, or at least half of them are stock. I'm not going to keep them all. But I've picked out 3 swords that you've seen them, you've certainly seen one of them in videos before, but you may not have thought that I'd pick them out as favourite swords. And I have not picked them out for their historical worth or value, in other words, provenance or whatever else, or their monetary value, or indeed their sentimental value. I purely picked them out because I think they're really nice swords, and they're 3 completely different types of swords as well. So first up, and this is probably in a way the most predictable, it is a sabre, that's right, but there are a few non-regulation things about it, and also it's not a Wilkinson. So a lot of my favourite non-regulation sabres will be Wilkinsons. I'm just going to relatively briefly tell you why this is one of my favourites. First of all, it's a longer than regulation blade, which, given that I'm 6'1", which is tall by Victorian standards when this was made, this is actually about perfect length for me for a blade. Okay, so that's a 34.5 inch blade, instead of usually it's 32.5 inch blade. Next up, it's been service sharpened, and I always love an antique sword that's been service sharpened. Okay, so it's longer, it's sharp, and it's an infantry officer's sword, and it does have a name on it, but I won't go into that on this video. It has a steel hilt. If we look on the inside, you can see it's got gilding remaining. So by regulation, these were usually brass hilts, and if we look at the back strap there, you can see usually this is rendered in brass instead of steel. But the person who ordered this sword wanted a steel hilt because steel is better than brass, basically. It's stronger, it's tougher, it's more protective, it's less likely to get damaged in use, it's less likely to stretch or get compressed, and so that hilt is more likely to remain solid. It's completely solid on the tang. But the reasons really why I love this is it just feels great. It's just got all the right combinations of kind of where all of the weight is distributed. It just feels absolutely nimble and perfect. It's not terribly light, but the weight distribution in it is lovely. And I have to point out, this is, I know from the proof slug down there, made by Benjamin Thurkle, and I'm a big fan. If you look on the Easton Antique Arms website, you can see I've written a fairly long article about the Thurkle family, the family of sword makers. And they're not as glamorous and famous as people like Wilkinson or even Pillin or Garden or Manton or all of these others. But actually, in their time, Thurkle were incredibly important. They manufactured swords for the military for mass purchase as well as private purchase officers' swords. And Benjamin and Edward Thurkle were excellent sword makers, and their swords are really nice. They're maybe quite not as chunky as Wilkinson, and the etching's not quite as good as Wilkinson, so they're kind of second tier in that sense, but they're just really good fighting weapons. And I've got some non-regulation swords by Thurkle, so they were making special order swords as well. And for all sorts of people. So it's just a lovely sword. I just love it. It's got a good combination of stats, and I think it's a lovely sword. And I like the fact that it's made by Benjamin Thurkle. The next example sword, this is the one you've seen in previous videos. So I've obviously got quite a lot of medieval swords, and quite a few of them are by Albion. And Albion are the kind of benchmark, I would say, for medieval sword making. But this isn't by Albion. This is by Mark Vickers, an English chap up north, of St. George Armoury. Okay, so St. George Armoury, and this is loosely based on the so-called Henry V sword. In fact, Henry V's sword is probably not Henry V's sword, it's probably Henry VI's sword, or at least it's not Henry V's sword, it's probably later. It's probably a sword more of the 1450s to 1480s rather than a sword of the Battle of Agincourt period. Not to say that this type of sword couldn't have been around at the time of Agincourt, it could, but this is a far more typical sword of the later 15th century, and in fact the association with Henry V is a little bit dubious. But anyway, again, something perhaps for, well, I have covered that in previous videos, but we'll probably talk about that again. I've got an idea to do a video with Dr. Toby Capwell on that very subject, in fact. Anyway, in due course. But the reasons I love this sword, well, it just feels amazing, and one of the reasons for that is it has a hollow pommel, which the original may or may not have. Now, Ewart Oakeshott said that the original pommel was partially hollow. And in fact, lots of medieval swords which have these large pommels, they are partially hollow pommels. I'm not 100% sure that the Westminster Abbey, aka Henry V's sword, is hollow and how hollow it is. I don't know if anyone's done a proper investigation of that, but anyway, this is a partially hollow pommel, which lots of medieval swords did have, and it just feels amazing in the hand. That's the first thing I love about it. The second thing I love about it is the hollow grind or hollow ground section. So it's got a mid-rib with hollow ground edge bevels, essentially. That's the next thing. Something I don't like about it, incidentally, is the grip, and I've been meaning to get it re-gripped for ages. Mark Vickers makes lovely swords, but his grips are a real letdown. But the last thing, it comes back to that blade quality again. Mark Vickers, the steel he uses, I believe, is EN45, which is quite a typical sword steel that's used in the UK, has been used for many years for reenactment. But his heat treatment is absolutely spot on. So every single Mark Vickers sword I have ever owned or used came super sharp and never needed sharpening in standard cutting use. They're just really hard and really durable edges, so really great. Now, I should add in, some people don't rate Mark Vickers' swords up there with the likes of Albion and such like. I do when it's a good one, and it's one of those examples I come back to of sometimes you get good ones, sometimes you don't. And I do know some people who've had some of his swords that have been not very impressive, frankly. I'm not gonna sort of completely badmouth, his work or anything like that, because everything I've had from him has been great. But I do know some negative experiences with some of the swords. But you do get that with every make, and this particular one is just absolutely lovely. I just think it's a great iconic sword, and this is a beautifully executed interpretation of that sword, if not a 100% replica, and it performs amazingly. It thrusts great, it cuts great, it handles great. This is one of those swords I'd happily, in my armour, if I had to go to war in my armour tomorrow, this is probably the sword I'd take as my sidearm. Okay, that's probably the sword I would wear with my armour. So finally, this one might come as a little bit of a surprise. So I've, in the last, my patrons on Patreon will know all about this, but I've been venturing into the world of antique Japanese swords. It's an expensive world, but I have just been dipping my toes into it, the cheaper end of the spectrum. And I have bought several things recently, actually, that are antique and Japanese. And this one, I just really, really like. I can't put it down. I can't stop playing with it. It is a small Edo period wakizashi by a known maker. It's signed and everything else, and it's got matching koshirai. Although whether this particular suka always lived with this blade, I don't know. But it is just really, really nice, and it feels just amazing in the hand. The way it moves, its heft to it. It's a beautiful, beautiful blade in good polish. You can see the hamon very clearly. And it's got a nice kind of assertive shape to the kasaki. I absolutely love the bohi or fuller. It's just very nicely executed. The detailing on this as an artistic object, I'll just see if you guys can see, it's got a little sort of village scene there, which has got gilding on it. You can see sea and little houses and birds flying up in the sky. That's actually repeated up on the fuchi up here. You can see there, and on the other side you can see a mountain scene, and it got quite an organic, it's quite an old-fashioned koto style, shall we say, type of tsuba, which is of a shape that's been around for a very long time, but it's done in quite an organic, it's almost got a sort of wood-grained finish in the bronze. Very attractive habaki as well, with copper habaki with gilding decoration on it. Very tight and nice silk ito on the grip or suka, and yeah, it's just lovely. But the main reason I love it is so I've bought, like I said, I bought a few Japanese things recently. Apart from that, this has got pretty stuff on it, which is always nice, of course, and even the saya is rather nice as well, and it's pretty good condition. It's how it handles, it's the size, it's only an 18-inch blade, but it's just, if I had a large katana, as you know I like longer katanas or tachi, if I had one of those, for my wakizashi kind of backup everyday carry, or indeed something to use in the left hand with a katana, this is just about right. It's got the right amount of presence in the blade, and the way it moves just feels so nice. And I love its proportions, and I love the fact that it's quite a short grip as well. I'm not keen on wakizashis where the grip is where the suka is too long. So there we go, 3 swords that you may not have thought, and as I say, sometimes it just comes down to how the thing feels in your hand, and it's a very subjective and personal thing as well. You know, if you came and handled all of my sword collection, you would pick probably completely different swords to me. The ones that speak to me usually are the ones that just feel great in my hand for what they are. That doesn't mean that what I expect a saber to handle like is at all what I expect an alarming sword to handle. I don't hold them in the same way, I don't expect them to move in the same way or do the same job. And equally again, if I come down to something like a wakizashi, I don't expect this to move in the same way as I expect a saber or an arming sword to move. And you know, as an extreme example, if I come to a cutlass or in this case a sword bayonet, I don't expect that to handle in the same way either. It's about the thing feeling right and also performing right, and if we're using these things for cutting or training in any sense, it has to move right, be the right proportions for you, have the nice grip surface, feel grippy and good in your hand, or however you like it, if you like a smaller grip or a bigger grip. But also, like I say, if you're cutting or fencing with a weapon, it also has to be durable. It has to have the right amount of flex in the blade, what you like in the thrust, or or for penetrating a target. For cutting, you want it to have the centre of percussion where you like it, and there's just so many factors that come together to add up to make these magical swords that just end up being special to you. And that's one of the great things about buying lots of swords, selling lots of swords, having lots of swords come through your hands. The ones that stay with you, the ones that you just can't quite part with, or the ones that you regret parting with, they're the special ones. Don't let them go. Anyway, interested to hear your comments and your thoughts. What are your special swords? Do you have a sword which, rareness or value or whatever aside, is just, for reasons you can't quite fully explain, is just special to you? Interested to read your comments below. What are your special swords? Give us a like and subscribe, and I will see you really soon again on the channel for another video. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.